I'm available. Okay. All right, thank you very much. For the record, my name is Rebecca Ruff. I'm a Senior Operating Budget Manager for the Department of Legislative Services. I'm here today to present you with a high-level overview of the fiscal briefing that summarizes what we know to date in the Governor's fiscal 2024 budget plan. So I have some good news to start out with. We're continuing to see revenues outperform the estimates. Fiscal 2022 closed with a cash balance almost $5.5 billion. And fiscal 2023, we're estimating is going to close with a cash balance of about $2.3 billion and a structural surplus of $1.1 billion. The governor's plan, as introduced, leaves a 10% balance in the rainy day fund, an estimated cash balance of $820 million, and a structural surplus of $337 million. So all of these measures either meet or exceed the spending affordability goals that were set by that committee in December of last year. General fund spending, if you look at the top part of this page, you can see that in total, all funds spending declines by about 1.8%. This is due to a 4.4% reduction in general funds and an 8.3% reduction in federal funds. The reduced federal funding is largely reflective of the dissipation of ARPA funds, the federal COVID stimulus funds that we've been receiving for the past few years. They're dwindling out and not as heavily reflected in the fiscal 2024 budget. One thing worth noting with regard to these fund changes is that the biggest driver of the decrease in general funds that is impacting the overall total decrease in funding actually relates to the rainy day fund appropriation. Statute required that there would be a $2.3 billion appropriation to the rainy day fund in fiscal 2023. There is no appropriation to the rainy day fund provided in fiscal 2024, although it is maintained at a 10% equivalent of general fund revenues. And that's because the statutorily required appropriation is actually redirected in the governor's plan through the use of a BRFA. He is redirecting $500 million of that appropriation to send the revenues to the Blueprint Fund in order to help offset future implementation costs. And he's also redirecting $500 million to the dedicated purpose account to support future transportation capital projects. And so if you were to exclude the rainy day fund from the calculation, funds would actually increase by about 1.9% overall, and we would see general fund growth of about 4.3%. Sorry, my finger slid a little too fast. The governor's budget does include a few tax proposals for you to be aware of. These include exempting military retirement income from the income tax, establishing a more robust child tax credit, and removing the sunset on the temporary enhancements to the earned income tax credit that was enacted during the 2021 session. You can see that the estimated impact of enacting all three pieces of legislation would be a reduction of just over $200 million in general fund revenues. The middle of this exhibit on page 2 highlights a few of the other spending initiatives that the governor has in his budget plan that are contingent on legislation. They include accelerating the provider rate increase in order to align with an accelerated effective date of the $15 minimum wage, a one-time reduction to the hospital assessment, two pieces of legislation referred to as the Maryland Educator Shortage Act and the Innovation Economy Infrastructure Act, which our staff are still exploring exactly what the components are of those pieces of legislation. There's some timing changes and adjustments that are required, legislation affecting the homeowner's property tax credit refund, and also the governor is proposing to provide health benefit coverage for National Guard members. The health area is a little bit out of my wheelhouse, so I would probably prefer to provide you with an accurate explanation after the briefing in the form of a letter rather than give you misinformation right now. Okay. But I can follow up about that. Okay. So For the next slide that I'd like to draw your attention to is the fact that this is the general fund structural budget outlook. And if you look at this, the blue bars are the 5-year forecast provided by the administration. And then what we have for you is a little bit of bad news in that although the budget does appear to be sustainable for the next few years, what's also reported is beginning in fiscal 2027, there is a projected significant deficit in the blueprint fund associated with the out-year implementation of that legislation. And so what this chart shows you is that if you were to account for both the general fund spending in the plan and layer on the shortfall in the blueprint fund, which would require general funds to backfill, by fiscal 2027, we're looking at a structural shortfall that nears $1 billion and grows to about $1.2 billion by fiscal 2028. The unexpected shortfall in the Blueprint Fund is largely associated with an unexpected increase in students who have been determined to be eligible for free and reduced price meals. I actually have a chart. This chart shows you comparatively the growth in that population. You can see that it had been declining during the pandemic, but it grows by over 110,000 students in the budget that the legislature is considering this year. We're exploring what's going on with those numbers, working with the administration and MSDE to understand them better. However, it does appear that a large driver of this increase is this is the first time that we've done direct certification, which is to utilize Medicaid and other entitlement enrollment data and match that against the school information in order to determine the eligibility for students based on their poverty levels as being eligible for other entitlement programs. There's a few things going on here which make the waters a little bit muddy. But what it is we think that we're doing a better job of capturing students who may not have been reporting and applying for free and reduced price meals in the past, but who would have otherwise been eligible. The other complicating thing that's going on is because of the pandemic, for the last couple of years, the entitlement programs haven't been re-evaluating whether the people that have been receiving those benefits remain entitled to those benefits. And so it's possible that in the future we could see a drop-off of this population as they go through that re-enrollment process, which could take up to a year to complete. But for now, this is the situation that we're looking at, and so the funding in the budget and the forecast reflects that. Revenues have been considerably higher. General fund revenues have been considerably higher because there's been federal fund support, not just to the states, but to individuals. And there's also been growth in income that result in additional income taxes and create sizable general fund balances that have allowed that funding to flow through. Unfortunately, I'm not an economist, and so I can certainly put you into contact with someone who can speak more to the economic side of what's going on with the revenues. A lot of the belief is not only just that there's been federal stimulus funds appropriated through the budget, but that the general flow of federal support throughout all of the economy and to all the individuals and businesses in the states have helped to contribute and boost up the availability of general fund revenues to be able to appropriate now as the federal funds are tapering off. No, that's fine. That's what I'm here for. Okay, so this chart gives you an idea of how the governor has allocated the surplus. As of December 2022, DLS was projecting a $3.6 billion surplus. The fiscal 2024, at the close of that budget year, is expected to have a cash surplus of $820 million. Several of these things I've already mentioned. There is the first two items, which is the $1 billion that he's redirecting from the rainy day fund to the blueprint and the transportation costs. There's $218 million provided for the acceleration of the provider rate increases to match with the acceleration of the minimum wage. The $204 million associated with his tax relief package. There's an additional $149 million in general funds provided in PAYGO, above what we had anticipated in our baseline. And then there is also additional funding for the community colleges. This is largely flow through from an increase in the per student amount that is allocated to the four-year institutions that flows through into the formulas for the community colleges. There is an additional $114 million in the current year budget, fiscal 2023, that DLS had anticipated would be returned from the agencies because most state agencies are experiencing historically high vacancy rates, which provides them with excess funding. The administration is allowing those agencies to retain the funds in the current budget, I think with the hope that they improve their hiring efforts. There's $78 million provided for behavioral health infrastructure investments. Mentioned the reduction for the hospital assessment. Police aid funding is maintained at the fiscal 2023 level, which does provide an additional $46 million to local jurisdictions above the formula amount. It's our understanding that because this will be allocated consistent with language that was in the fiscal 2023 budget, which requires that this $46 million be allocated based on how crime rates are occurring across the state. There's some funding for K-12 education hold harmless grants in certain jurisdictions. The budget permanently enhances the monthly cash assistance benefits at $45 per person, which requires an additional $32 million. Of note is the fact that the governor's budget actually creates two new programs, one being the West North Avenue Development Authority, which is an entity that was previously existed. It was created through legislation and it had received some funding. The governor has opted to draw it out of its, where it had been previously located within an additional agency, largely receiving grant funds through the Board of Public Works, and is now making it its own independent entity. The other much larger one is the creation of the new Department of Service and Civic Innovation, which it's believed that this will largely be the agency that spearheads the governor's initiative of a service year after completing high school. There's $10 million provided again to food banks, and then I believe the rest of them I had already mentioned in my earlier comments. There are some other adjustments that our baseline budget didn't account for, which reflect additional spending in the budget. Medicaid enrollment, behavioral health costs are higher than we had anticipated. There's also almost $160 million in additional funding for cybersecurity legislation. This is to be consistent with legislation that was passed last session that required a specific amount of cybersecurity support be allocated for use for that purpose. And then we already discussed the enhancements for the education aid. This largely caps most of the changes that I already talked about, but there's additional detail here in these bullets for you to reference. If you're interested, there are provider rate increases for most healthcare providers. These range from 3 to 4%. K-12 education funding in general grows by about 9.2%. Of note, and maybe of interest to you, is the fact that the governor's budget does provide $150 million for the General Assembly to allocate for operating and capital priorities. The capital budget itself does provide $1.2 billion in GO bond funding and also an additional $1.1 billion in PAYGO support in the operating budget. And then there are just a few issues that we want to bring to the legislature's attention that may need to be considered as you move forward with your actions on the budget. And the biggest one being whether or not or in what way you want to address the long-term sustainability question. As that chart on the structural deficit showed you, you are in an okay spot for the next 2 or 3 years, but come fiscal 2027, there will be a real problem unless additional revenues or some other consideration is created to accommodate that shortfall. You'll have to decide how to address the governor's legislative package with the tax relief and the other spending initiatives. One big issue that our analyses are exploring and that the administration has also echoed as a major concern is how to address the staffing problem for state agencies. I think all but 2 major departments in the state have a vacancy rate above 10%, and so it's fairly concerning. There's a lot of impacts. They vary widely by agency as to what they are, but the Department of Public Safety and Correctional Services is currently spending close to $170 million on overtime in order to accommodate their staffing shortages in their correctional facilities.
I don't want to interrupt you, but I just have a question. The out-year structural deficit that comes on in, 2027, is this because the governor's spending this year, a lot of it is committing us year after year? For example, I'm assuming the revenue for transportation capital needs, that's capital, so that's not an ongoing obligation. But I assume, I guess, the blueprint fund going forward, the children's free and reduced lunch, would be ongoing until the Medicaid rolls go down or whatever is bringing it up. And so for the rest of the list on 7, is the reason we're going to get into a structural out-year deficit because most of what's on page 7 is ongoing and committed and becomes somewhat mandated? Or is it also because you're projecting, and if it's in here somewhere, just tell me what page, on other years that our own revenue projections in the out years are going to go down? Because a lot of the reason we've had so much money is how well the market has done, capital gains, and a lot of other things in Maryland that shows our affluence. So is that I know it's a lot to ask you, but is there an easy answer to that, or you want to follow up with that?
It's a mix.
Okay, sorry.
As far as the out-year revenue forecast, we utilize whatever forecast BRE puts out. This is calculated based on the December revenue forecast. It'll be updated again when BRE puts out a revised forecast in March. I can certainly provide you with a copy of that forecast.
Yeah, just so I can, if that's going down.
Sure.
If that's the issue, or would you say the driver is more that the governor is taking, because we're going to give him the break of not sweeping this money into the rainy day fund, is he spending it on one-time or short-term things, or is he actually increasing our baseline budget permanently, and that's the main driver for the out-year structural deficit?
Quite a few of these things on this list are ongoing. I mean, a big driver of our ongoing costs are personnel expenses, which state employees, and I certainly don't want to be seen in opposition in any way, but I think increasing salaries is something that we've definitely noted when we've explored what's going on with the agencies, but there was a 4.5% increase provided in November. That's an ongoing expense. There's an additional 2% COLA and increments provided in the fiscal 2024 budget. That's an ongoing expense. The tax relief is considered to be ongoing. The provider rate increases, both the one here to align with the increase in the minimum wage, and then
So would you say almost on page 7, everything's ongoing except, is it more like that, and except would be like the transportation capital needs would be not driving that out year structural deficit, or?
Sure. I'd probably have to go through the list itself in order to be able, but I can certainly.
And then just one last question on page 9 at the bottom. So this, I'm sorry, I don't understand the $150 million earmarked in the budget for General Assembly operating and capital projects. Could you just briefly explain that to me?
Yeah, of course. So there is $150 million currently appropriated in the dedicated purpose account, which is within the state reserve fund. And it's the budget just specifies that it's available for operating and capital legislative priorities, with the legislature's new authority to be able to add funds directly to the budget. The idea being that you could, instead of where you formerly would have had to add language restricting the appropriation and putting in your specific priorities with the hope that the governor funds them, you can now just simply cut that appropriation and you can just add directly in the appropriated funds for the projects that the legislature deems to be worthy of that $150 million.
So this is extra money available to us in the dedicated purpose account, is that correct?
Yes, the administration specifically earmarked these funds for the legislature to allocate as they see fit.
Thank you.
No, that's, I think the only other point that I was remiss in noting is the fact that the current budget outside of the Department of Transportation does not recognize quite a bit of funding that we're expecting through the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act and the Inflation Reduction Act. And that is, in total, we think we're going to receive about $8.1 billion through the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. About $6.7 billion of that is captured in MDOT's capital plan, but that's over the next 6 years that will receive that funds. The amount of funding in fiscal 2024 is actually relatively small. For the other outstanding funds, we're not seeing a lot of that budgeted in the allowance so far. It's possible that it may come in throughout the course of the fiscal year, but a lot of the funds, particularly in the Inflation Reduction Act, are competitive. And so at this point, we're still awaiting federal guidance for agencies to be able to even begin applying for funding through those programs. But other than that, that's what I have for you today, unless you have any additional questions. You're welcome. Sure.
All right, so thank you again. Thank you very much. So we're going to take about a 5-minute break we have to convert and transfer over the stream for YouTube and for Zoom at the same time. So we're going to take a 5-minute break, then we'll start off. I see that the treasurer is here, and then we'll start off with that bill, and then I see we have 2 other bills that will come right behind. So give us 5 minutes, and we'll start.